Good evening, my Lord Bishop, Reverend Fathers, plebs, schismatics. Maybe I should say fellow schismatics. I enjoyed the meeting very much today, and there's a lot of things I heard which I wish I had known earlier in my life as a father and a brother and various other things. So it has been very, if I hadn't this hanging over me, I would have enjoyed it a lot better, but I've learned a lot. And I hope I'm sure you have too. So the intellectual tone or spiritual tone might be going to drop a little bit. And I was told, Father Kimball, who thank you for inviting me onto this nightmare, that it was very poor judgment on his part to position my talk immediately before a replay of the All-Ireland football final, because I have a lot here. So you'll be lucky if you get to in for the second half. I'm only joking. We sort of agreed that we would try and give you some information on relationships and sexuality education, and maybe an idea of what seems to be coming down the tracks in Ireland in the not too distant future. So I was going to start by recalling an incident that happened in the hospital a few years ago. Not an important incident at all, but it happened on a Saturday evening, as all, if you work in a job like mine, they always seem to happen on a Saturday evening at 7 o'clock when there's no help around. In this case, the house doctor took a call from a neighbouring hospital which didn't have a maternity unit, and a woman had been admitted to their emergency department with severe abdominal pain, and in the course of the investigations they found that she had a positive pregnancy test and wanted to transfer the patient to us, which happened. She was moved by ambulance. It took about an hour, and when she arrived in the hospital she was quite unwell. She was shocked. She had severe pain. It didn't take very long to make a diagnosis of an ectopic pregnancy, and she was rushed to the operating theatre and recovered uneventfully. At the hospital meeting the following Wednesday, where we discuss problems in the hospital or interesting cases or teaching exercise, it's partly teaching exercise, the young doctor who took the call and admitted the woman presented the case. So we discussed the management. Was everything done correctly? What could have been improved? How it all happened and so on. So at the end I said to the young doctor, well, Maria, what did you learn from all that? And she paused for a moment and she sort of blurted out, well, it just shows you can't trust anybody. And I didn't really realise up until that moment that she was quite upset about the case. She found it very stressful. And she felt that she should have been warned by the other hospital that the woman was quite ill and an emergency, and she felt that she had been misled, which may not be the case, because it could have the deterioration in the patient's condition could have occurred while she was being transferred. But in any case, I was rather surprised at our blanket definition that you can trust nobody. So I'm very interested in the question of trust. I have been for many years. And if you ever listen to BBC Radio 4, every year there's a series of lectures called the Reith Lectures. They're in honour of Lord Reith, who was the first chairman of the BBC. And depending on the speakers from year to year, it can be quite interesting. And in 2002, the lectures were given by a Cambridge philosopher called Honora O'Neill. She's now Baroness O'Neill, and she's originally from Northern Ireland. And the title of the lecture series was A Question of Trust. And it has been written that there was more public response to this series of lectures than any Reith lectures before or since, showing that trust was a serious question among members of the public. You can still listen to those lectures on the BBC website, and they've been published as well. But she describes in detail how breakdowns in trust have happened in many areas of the health service, but also in education, politics, and other areas of life. She describes one sequence which is very true, I think. And I don't know if you watched television, but a few weeks ago there was an expose Prime Time investigates, looking at creches in Dublin and supposed mistreatment of children. It was a very good example of what she was talking about. There's a big saturation media coverage of this, I didn't see the programme, but of this apparent neglect of children. The politicians are drawn in. What are you going to do about it? There's a response, an investigation, a committee, a People's Assembly, something like that. And a series of recommendations are made, and a raft of new regulations are brought in to deal with the scandal. Honora O'Neill says, "Show me the evidence that increasing the number of regulations and guidelines actually solves anything." And the Dublin creches case illustrates it very clearly, because the Minister for Children, Catherine Zappone, has announced a whole raft of new regulations. Whether they do any good or not never seems to be dealt with. The people who are trying to deliver services, particularly in the health service, she goes on to say that people find it very difficult to handle the regulations, particularly if there's no resources put in to support them. One example was in schools, where in England, schools are classified on league tables. And if you're doing badly on the league tables, you get into trouble. So the school's response may be, instead of getting your students to learn physics, you start teaching them domestic economy, where it's easier to get an A, and you go up in the league tables, and the school appears better than it is. Maybe the most nefarious example in the health service would be, it's very bad news politically for the Minister for Health to have patients on trolleys, and it gets into the media. So this is from the UK again, but in hospitals, the number of patients who are in the hospital is counted at midnight. So if an ambulance arrives at the hospital, let's say 11:30, and the patient's not too bad, it may be advantageous just to leave them in the ambulance until after the count is done at midnight. And this actually happens, or has happened anyway. So the question is, one of the results of these media outcries, of course, is that the state takes more and more control by regulations, even if they don't work. So the question of trust, I'm saying, is who can you trust? And it's relevant to what I'm discussing here today, which is relationships and sexuality education. One of the most striking things about all these public moral decisions we've had over the last few years is how rapidly things happen. And we went from civil partnerships to gay marriage in the space of 4 years. We now have the police and the army marching in gay pride marches. Abortion to save the mother's life came in 2013. It becomes abortion on demand in 2018. And one of the most striking things, having been somewhat involved in all of that, is the political situation where politicians who had made pro-life statements in the very recent past can do a complete U-turn and support a liberal abortion act. And this is where trust in politicians becomes a problem. It put me in mind of a statement by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who was mentioned earlier today. He gave a commencement address at Harvard University referred to as one of the great speeches of the 20th century. It drove the Americans mad. And he said what struck him most about the political life in the free West, which he had just been kicked out of the Soviet Union, he said, is a decline in courage maybe the most striking feature that an outsider observer notices in the West today. This is written 35 years ago. The Western world has lost its civic courage both as a whole and separately, in each country, in each government, in each political party, and of course in the United Nations. So I think we have little to expect from the political side if we're looking at the question of RSE, relationships and sexuality education. And two things that were said at the end of the last referendum was, the North is next, and our next task is to sort out sex education. So the biggest input, as I will tell you later on, of those who were involved in the this RSE programme are those who were involved in the gay marriage and abortion referenda. And I have a feeling that these people, having got those referenda through, have worked themselves out of a job, and that this is their latest project in social engineering. There's one important difference, I think, between relationships and sexuality education and those two referenda. If you take the gay marriage thing, it was framed as I want to be happy. You're depriving me of my chance of happiness. Why would you stop me? You can be married yourself. And similarly in the abortion thing, it was, I know you're opposed to abortion, that's okay, but what about me? You're depriving me of my rights. So they were asking for permission to do something that wasn't going to affect us. In the case of RSE, for the first time maybe, this bandwagon of, let's call it liberal secularism, wants to do things to us. Or worse still, they want to do things to our children. So, just to go off the point once more, the last time maybe, the retired Pope Benedict recently wrote about the sexual abuse crisis in the church, which he attributed to two principal factors. Firstly was the sexual revolution, 1968 has already been mentioned today. And secondly was a collapse in Catholic moral theology in the 1970s and 80s, which he says left the church defenseless against the sexual revolution. The most telling sentence about the abuse crisis he put in was, only where faith no longer determines the action of man are such offences possible. I think it would be fair to say that faith no longer determines the actions of our politicians or even the population at large in Ireland. The word may be apostasy, and it relates to those same two factors that Benedict has written about. And the sexual revolution is being played out perhaps in the end game in the subject of RSE, or relationships. Is this a vast conspiracy? Well, I don't think a conspiratorial life is necessarily very healthy. It's likely to make you mentally ill. And sometimes the conspiracy is in plain sight and we just don't see it. I don't know if any of you have read John Waters' recent new book, Give Us Back the Bad Roads, but I would strongly recommend it as a very clear and accurate picture of where Ireland is now. And it's not a pretty picture, but it's not without hope either. And he describes in some detail his own treatment by the gay lobby when he questioned gay marriage. And he's a good writer and he's very courageous. One of the chapters in the book is called An Offer You Can't Refuse. And it gives a description of how gay marriage came about. He goes back to 1989 to a book written by two Americans called After the Ball, How America Will Conquer Its Fear and Hatred of Gays in the 90s. I'll quote, gayness has to be normalized and gays presented as victims so that straights would be inclined by reflex to assume the role of protectors. Our campaign should not demand direct support for homosexual practices. It should instead take anti-discrimination as its theme. Free speech, freedom of association, and equality were to be the issues brought to the public mind. That's 1989, but that language is very familiar, I think, to me anyway, over the last few years in this country. Various concepts were used for psychological manipulation, emotional modelling, and so on, which I have not got time to go into. But going on from John Waters' description, which is well worth reading, I would like to strongly if you're interested in this area, I would like to strongly recommend a book which I only got very recently, and it's called The Global Sexual Revolution. The author is a woman called Gabrielle Kubi. She's German. It's been translated into English in 2016, I think. And she gives, I think, the best account of the history of that revolution and how the chaos created by gender ideology has become global. I found it very difficult to deal with this subject, but just briefly, if you say, where did sex education come from? It probably came after, people would say after the Second World War, and it was developed initially with the intention of preventing sexually transmitted diseases and unplanned pregnancy. A more liberal and explicit education is attributed to the AIDS epidemic of the 1980s, when there was a fear that this disease was going to infect everybody. So the only objectives were the avoidance of sexually transmitted diseases and pregnancy. And did it work? Well, we can't go into the whole literature, but if you're a medic and you are concerned about does such and such a treatment work, and you want to get the research on this from all over the world, you consult a thing called the Cochrane database, which originally started in Oxford in England. It studies all the clinical trials for a particular treatment, comes to a decision whether a drug, say for blood pressure, works or not. It deals purely with effectiveness. It doesn't have any ideological axe to grind. So if you consult, does the Cochrane database have any research on the effectiveness of sex education? It does, but you may not have heard about it. It was published in 2016, and I read somewhere that it was the quietest piece of research that was published anywhere because no press paid any attention to it. It said that the effectiveness of sex education in reducing either the incidence of sex STDs or unplanned pregnancy, that there was no evidence that either were reduced by sex education programs. It looked at studies from Africa, Europe, and other places. The only things that it did show was the rates of STDs and unplanned pregnancy were reduced in Africa if children were provided with a school uniform and some sort of financial support. So this evidence is absent. You might say, well, why are we getting this sex education? Anyway, what we're looking at in Ireland is replicated in other places. There has been an outcry in California against very explicit sex education. In the UK, there's a new system just about to begin to become legal in 2020, where sex education is compulsory at secondary level. And in Ireland, in April 2018, the Minister for Education, Mr. Bruton, asked the National Council for Curriculum and Assessment, the NCCA, to review sex education in Ireland, with 6 topics to be addressed. Number 1 was consent, what it means. Number 2, developments in contraception. Number 3, healthy, positive sexual expression and relationships. Number 4, safe use of the internet. Number 5, social media and its effect on relationships and self-esteem. And number 6, just added in last, LGBTQ plus matters. So in July of this year, the NCCA issued a draft report. I'm not sure when the final report will be issued, but it's worth pointing out to all of you that this draft report is open to submissions still up until Friday the 25th of October 2019. The draft describes its work involving roundtable meetings, a symposium, focus groups, school principals, schools and so on, and it looked at research and surveys of students. The National Parents Council did surveys of parents and students and so on. And the report invited written submissions, and these are also published online. I'm going to try to give you some sort of a picture of what these were like. So submissions were analysed by a member of the NCCA using a method of a critical friend. I don't know exactly what this means, but it's some sort of way of analysing what things people write down. So I'd like to express my own reservations from personal experience about focus groups, which are open to groupthink, and online surveys, which, like the Eurovision Song Contest, are open to manipulation. I've personal experience of that, but I haven't time to go into it there. The style of the report, not the Eurovision Song Contest. The style of the report is to make a statement, and then it's backed up by a quotation from one of the study events that I've mentioned. Example. Statement. Students of all ages considered the heteronormative lens to which RSE is taught as problematic. They spoke about the need to have opportunities to learn about and normalise the diversity of relationships and sexual identities that exist. This is in the report. Now, it doesn't give any indication of the number of students who had this view, and I presume the language heteronormative lens doesn't come from a student. It comes from a critical friend, perhaps. But it's unlikely, I think, that a second-level student would use it. But one of the quotes used to support this statement is, "We had no education on same-sex relationships or about questioning gender identity." Brackets, post-primary student online survey. I wonder whether even this sounds like the language of a school student who seems to want to know both about same-sex relationships and gender. And it could have been, as far as I understand it, written by anybody. Discussing the question of parents and so on, said a small number of parents are vehemently opposed to RSE being taught in schools, but again, there's no quantification. The views of parents are quite divergent with regard to the appropriate time for children to begin learning about relationships and sexuality. And for many parents, it's seen as something that needs to be taught incrementally from an early age. This is a quote, but again, there's no quantification or specifics. In the UK, it has been pointed out that reservations expressed by parents have been ignored. And one of the key quotes was taken from a parent. It said, "Knowledge is a protective factor not only for unintended pregnancy and STIs, but also for sexual violence." And as I've already said, the evidence of this treatment of this statement is very doubtful. So there are repeated allusions to LGBT awareness, but in the report itself without being specific as to what might be offered. There are valid concerns expressed about the dangers of pornography, social media, sexting and so on, but again without offering any clear direction. One section of the report deals with the views of stakeholders on these things. This appears to be teachers, managers, inspectors and so on, but I could see no evidence that parents were considered to be stakeholders. They refer specifically to a report. To meet best international standards, what they requires is to look at what was set down by the World Health Organization in its Standard for Sexuality Education in Europe 2010. So this is a well-known report, I understand, and Dr. Gabriel Kubi's discussion on that particular document says, the WHO, which is a respected healthcare body, if there's an outbreak of Ebola virus, the WHO are going to be speaking about it. I don't know where they fit in with sex education, but they're being quoted as the reliable authority. The WHO functions on the anthropological premise that humans have a need for sexual activity from birth on, and they have a right to it. Adults allegedly should stimulate this need right from the beginning, speak to the child in detail at every age level about sexual acts, and give them the opportunity to live out their sexual needs free of gender stereotypes. She gives an example from the ages of 4 to 6. A child learns to name each body part, and caregivers are to wash every part of the body and talk about sexual matters in sexual language. The child should be given information about enjoyment and pleasure when touching one's own body in early childhood masturbation. I'll stop there. Anyway, interestingly, Gabriel Kubi was successful in Germany in having a sexual education book removed from the curriculum called Body, Love and Playing Doctor, which amongst other things encouraged parents to engage in sexually oriented games with their children. So it does show that maybe the public can do something about it. One can only guess as to what the likely program is. It's very vague and non-specific and couched, as I say, in diplomatic language. But one of the most frequent quotes throughout is that young people criticize RSE because it's too negative and it's all prohibitions. Unfortunately, I think RSE is going to be like that if you're going to keep your children safe. Just to go on then, one more area of this report, the NCCA published 58 of 65 written submissions. The largest number of submissions came from LGBT groups, 8. These are Belong To, LGBT Ireland, Shout Out, Spun Out, Squishy Couch, Sexual Health Centre Cork, Transgender Equality Network of Ireland, and Gender Orientation and Sexual Health Limerick. There were what I would call abortion groups. That's Amnesty, Abortion Rights Alliance, and Irish Family Planning Association. So they're the largest group. The second largest group were Catholic groups, including Accord, Catholics, Trustee Schools, one diocese. Anybody like to guess? Elphin, correct, right first time. The Lumen Fidei Institute, the Iona Institute, and so on. Anyway, it is difficult to give the other groups like Atheist Ireland and Inclusion Ireland and so on. I can't give you a complete picture of the spectrum, but LGBT groups and teachers' union groups who were very much on the same line disparaged school ethos. Many advocated a standardised programme, compulsory in all schools, religious or secular. Interestingly, the submission from the Irish National Teachers Organisation did not come from the union as a whole, but from their LGBT group. Of the individual submissions then, 2 came from gay activists who were teaching RSE, and one from a teacher who was also teaching RSE, who represented himself as teacher and member of Atheist Ireland. So that's maybe to give you some sort of flavour. Now, one interesting thing is the National Parents Council did a survey of about 3,000 parents, asking them many questions, but did not include anything about the LGBT question. But the most striking thing in the submission from the National Parents Council, which was not covered in the report as far as I could see, was an answer to the question, how important is it that your school consults you about how it teaches RSE? 95% of parents said that was important. The next question, how important is it that the school consults you about the content of what will be taught? 97% considered it important. The report doesn't seem to cover this, and it's very clear from reading, if you take, say, the LGBT groups, Amnesty and so on, and the Catholic ones, is that the secularist ones never mention the parents. The Catholic ones all do. And in fact, overall, the Catholic submissions, I thought, had a very good feel, a positive view of people, children made in the image of God and so on. But it's in such marked contrast to the other side, which is very selfish. It's about consent, what you are entitled to do, and so on. And it's not... There's something unwholesome about it aside from what they're proposing. Now, there's considerable discussion about pornography and an acknowledgement of the serious situation of social media. It must be said, very few clear solutions offered as to what could be done apart from more education. Some would see pornography as something to be managed rather than prohibited, to use the words, to be discussed in a stigma-free way. This despite evidence that addiction to pornography physically changes your brain and leads to increased sexual violence against women. This is something I was not aware of, and it comes from Gabriel Kubi, is that sexual abuse is a growing problem for children and teenagers among themselves. And it is in 14 to 16-year-olds who are at the greatest risk of sexually abusing children. She attributes this growing problem to sex education and pornography. When I read that, I immediately came to my mind the murder of a young girl, Anna Kriegel, in Dublin. It clearly had its origin in online pornography. And if you recall, the judge did not allow the jury access to the knowledge that one of the boys involved, aged 13, had over 5,000 pornographic images of great violence. Sister Mary Bernard referred to something very lovely this morning about, I don't know if I remember it correctly, but if a child admires somebody, they will imitate them. Unfortunately, if a child sees pornography, I think they will imitate that. And I think there's evidence of that. Secondly, as you may recall, a teacher in County Cavan murdered his wife and 3 children before killing himself. And it was clearly suggested that he had a problem with online pornography. The state so far has taken no action against this. I think that some other countries are, including England and Germany. So in this report, many people commented on the problem. Only one submission that I could identify from the Lumen Fidei Institute proposed that it's the government's task to shut this down, to remove it. Sexual imagery, we're surrounded by images, but we're bombarded with... If you get sexual images coming towards you, it has been known in the church for millennia that sexual images are dangerous. I read one saint from the 10th century dispensing spiritual advice about repentance. He said, we should examine in detail all the sins we have committed, even back to childhood. But he says, except carnal sins, for the remembrance of these is harmful. So, recalling sexual imagery can start the whole process off again. And I think a neutral stance on porn in this report. One submission said it is important to discuss why it is used and how to use it in a healthy manner. There is no healthy manner. Now, I don't know how I'm doing on the time. I just wanted to say then, as I say, there's a strong anti-Catholic mood in many of these submissions, and I think the marker is when you exclude the parents, who you're dealing with. So, getting towards the end, what can you or I do about the situation at the moment? First of all, you might consider making a submission, as I mentioned earlier on, to the National Council for Curriculum Assessment, NCCA. We don't know the specifics of the programme, but since the programme seems to be the same in California, in Britain and in Germany, I think we can reasonably surmise at what it's going to be like. And it's unlikely there will be any further consultation. And in my lower moments, I was wondering that maybe in practical terms, the best that might be achievable by making representations would be to strongly state that no parent should be compelled to put their child through this if they don't wish it. Compulsion appears to be part of the idea in the UK, and it wasn't directly mentioned in any of these, nor was it unmentioned, if you like. The strong mood that you should have compulsory RSE programme the same in all schools, secular or religious. They didn't say that children, only one specifically said children should be compelled to do it, but most people didn't say they should be allowed any opt-out. It seems that forcing children into it might be unconstitutional, since parents are the primary educators of their children. However, if you recall, the Children's Rights Referendum of 2012, which was put into the Constitution, says, where parents fail in their duty towards the children to such an extent that the safety or welfare of any of their children is likely to be prejudicially affected, the state, as guardian of the common good, shall endeavour to supply the place of the parents, but always with due regard for the natural and imprescriptible rights of the child. So I'd ask you, in this current climate of mistrust, could you see the state using this article to give vitally needed sex education to your children? I think it's not impossible. So, one more thing, well, maybe one or two. If it goes as it looks, can the SSPX or any other group make any influence on the state, the media, or even the courts and expect to win? I think it's a spiritual issue for sure. It endangers souls, but it's also now a political one. And taking this one issue and looking at it politically, I think if you want to influence legislators, you need to make alliances with others who take the same position, even if they don't believe the same thing or share your faith. Protecting children affects all parents. And I think it's significant that in the UK, the only significant objections to RSE has come from Muslims in the north of England. Catholics need to find allies about this issue in the public domain without compromising their own faith or asking others to compromise either. One more thing you could consider, I'm serious but I don't know how practical it is that in other countries is to take your children out of school and teach them yourself. I'm reading a book at the moment called Get Out Now, written by two female smart lawyers in America who are strongly recommending that people should not send their children to public schools in America. They're not a fringe group, and it may be that your child, grandchild or niece may need this action if the programme turns out as bad as it could do. Now, I think that's the end of my suggestions. I just wanted to, there was one little story, it might have been a bit gloomy what I was saying. There was one little story that I wanted to tell you, and I went to hear an American writer called Rod Dreher. You may have heard of him. He wrote a book called The Benedict Option. It's very, very an international bestseller, a sort of survival manual for Catholics. It's not Benedict, the Pope he's talking about, it's Saint Benedict. And the talk he gave in Dublin is available online, but not the questions afterwards. And the questions is what I wanted to refer to. He was asked by a worried father, I think it was, what can we do about education? And it's the only option to homeschool. So Dreher, in response, gave this. He said he described a visit to the Czech Republic where his book was being published, and visiting of a family that had gone through the communist era and preserved their faith. The father of the family was a committed Catholic, and Catholics in Soviet or Russian or Soviet communist times took the view that we keep our heads down and wait, hope things would improve. He didn't agree with that and started to protest publicly about abuses, and he was jailed. The reason he told the story was to describe how, when the children came home from school, the father, when he was around, asked in detail what they had been taught that day. If they were taught things that were wrong, like communist ideology, he would spend as long as it took to show them why it was wrong and teach them the truth. The children are now all adults. In fact, the father is dead. They're all committed Catholics. And they also described how, when the father was taken away to prison, their mother went through a similar procedure along with reading them good literature. And specifically, J.R.R. Tolkien took great credit from that family for saving their children. So both parents actively educated their children in spite of the school and the state, and they succeeded. So Dreher pointed out that things are bad here, but they're not that bad. And even if they do go bad, you still have the option to educate your children yourself. Finally, how can the church help with this question? First of all, in Ireland, I think the point of having schools that are called Catholic in name, where the children are being taught lies, is not on. It's time for the church to give people secular schools if they want them, and keep Catholicism as more than just a name. If people teaching your children are like the LGBT activists I described in the submissions, then they may ruin your child's life and destroy their faith. So no Catholic school can teach what is proposed. And I think it is for the bishops to stand up and say that this is unacceptable. We cannot allow it in Catholic schools. And if it comes in, they will withdraw from the school. It would be better for children to go to school to learn mathematics and regular subjects, and that the church would provide both religious instruction and sexual education outside the school. If you look at England, I think very few people realise this, but aside from being Catholic, in many cases, or Anglican, religious schools produce excellent academic results. Parents move house to get into the catchment for religious schools, some even getting baptised and pretending to be believers, so that their children can get the academic part of what a Christian education gives you. The superior results are attributed primarily to better discipline, which comes from a Christian ethos of respecting others. I don't think that the submitters of this exercise who hate ethos realise that ethos is anything other than church oppression. It may well be if schools are secularised and parents begin to see the other things that go wrong academically, that they might return to looking for Catholic or Protestant schools. And I think finally we need a Christian response to all of this. These people who are convinced that they are right they're troubled people. And the Christian response is speaking the truth, a calm exposition without hatred or anger. And these people who wish to transform sexuality are human beings too. I was trying to verify a quotation at lunchtime, which I read many years ago, which is from G.K. Chesterton, already referred to. I think he said, when a man goes to a brothel, he thinks he's looking for sexual favours, but in fact he's looking for God. And these people are on the wrong track, and it falls for us to try and rescue them. My daughter-in-law insisted I say this. She said you have to quote Romans 1:21. For this cause God delivered them up to shameful affections, for their women had changed the natural use into that use which is against nature. And in like manner the men also, leaving the natural use of the women, have burned in their lusts one towards the other, men with men, working that which is filthy, and receiving in themselves the recompense which was due to their error. St. Paul could not have been clearer. People are losing their jobs over this sexual revolution. But St. Paul also tells us we must pray without ceasing. That means 5 minutes time, 10 minutes time for the rest of your life. Several people told me after the abortion referendum that they'd never prayed so much in their lives. One said, I never prayed so much, and this is what I got. God had failed them. God did not give them what they wanted. And what they wanted was a good thing, or so it seemed. But as the bishop says, God is in charge. We know that God provides for us because we're all here today. It's not for us to tell God what to do. We must accept his inscrutable ways and trust that he has something much greater in mind than anything we can conceive of. So it occurred to me when I was preparing this, maybe some parents in particular might have thought that I was going to give them advice on relationships and sexual education, which I'm not competent to do. But I have a little list of books which might be helpful if you're concerned about that. And thank you for listening.